Hi there, it's Stephanie with Project Vibrancy, and I am here today to give you some of my favorite substitutions for inflammatory foods. So to give anti-inflammatory substitutions for commonly used inflammatory foods, and honestly they end up being more delicious than the original and are super easy to incorporate into your diet. So I'll just back up and say that my definition of inflammatory foods probably falls under the umbrella of foods that I have reactions to. So they can be nutritious foods, for instance, nuts and seeds, sometimes eggs, sometimes dairy. Those are really nutritious foods, but they're not if you are having reactions to them and they're causing you inflammation. It can be a good idea to do an elimination diet and avoid eating those foods for a period of time so that you can heal, work on healing your gut, and then hopefully reintroduce being able to eat those foods, and then they won't cause you inflammation. That's really what an elimination diet and a healing diet is for. But there are other foods on the list of inflammatory foods that should be always avoided, and that includes industrial oils, sugar, of course, and highly processed flour, and excessive amounts of alcohol. So I'm going to give you substitutions for all of these things very quickly, and hopefully you can switch out the inflammatory ones and be using the less reactive, the foods that tend to cause fewer reactions for people or are just more nutritious anyway, and honestly, like I said, taste better. So my favorite sub for dairy when I'm not eating dairy, and this can even be kind of a stand-in for eggs depending on how you're using it, is to use avocados. I mention eggs because I use mashed avocado oftentimes, and even kind of thin it out with a little bit of olive oil or avocado oil in place of mayonnaise. Or thin it out with some lemon. So avocado and lemon and maybe a little bit extra oil is a fantastic substitute for mayonnaise when you're making a tuna salad, you're making chicken salad, kind of those classic lunchtime salads. In the end, I prefer it to mayonnaise, and then it is egg-free. And I'm not a big fan of the vegan mayos. They count on soy, and soy oil falls under the industrial oils and is a highly reactive oil for a lot of people. So I tend to stay away from those vegan kind of substitute mayos and just go with avocados, which is a whole food and so delicious. So that's one of my favorites, but I use it for dairy too. So if I were having a hamburger or a sandwich where cheese would be incredibly welcome and delicious, I will just layer in avocado instead of the cheese, and you get the same mouthfeel and creaminess, and it ends up adding a lot of the same. I always think of it as existing in a certain part of my brain and kind of pushing buttons. The avocado in place of cheese on sandwiches definitely pushes all the same buttons. So the trick is to make sure that you salt it. I like to add even a little squeeze of lemon there as well, versus just using straight avocado, and you end up with something absolutely incredible. I love avocados in smoothies. I never put dairy in my smoothies, and I'm pretty sensitive to nut milks, so I don't put those in smoothies either, but it doesn't matter because I use a quarter of an avocado or half an avocado, depends on the size of the avocado, and then water. And that combination together is really a substitution for using milk or yogurt or a nut milk, and you end up with a wonderful creaminess and no reaction, actually anti-inflammatory properties. I totally love it. And then you can even use avocado to make chocolate pudding. I have a recipe on my blog, Fresh Tart. I'll put a link to it below. You've probably made it before. It's one of the more popular recipes on my website, and it is the easiest thing in the world. You just put avocado and either carob, if you're following AIP, or cocoa powder otherwise, and then sweeten with a little bit of maple syrup or honey and whip it all together, and it just turns into this absolutely beautiful chocolate mousse, kind of chocolate pudding situation. Some salt, tastes really good there. And anyway, takes, 5 minutes to make, and it is so fantastic and utterly dairy free. It can also be used for an icing. You can use it to ice cupcakes or cake, and it's really good for that too. So that's my first sub. I kind of combine dairy and eggs together. Eggs aren't dairy. I think you know that, but they kind of have some of the same properties, so I put them together. Number 2 is something I've been mentioning, the industrial oils. That includes canola, soy, any hydrogenated vegetable shortening like Crisco, that kind of stuff, which is pretty nasty. Hopefully nobody's eating that anymore. Corn oil doesn't show up that often anymore either, but is very, very much on the list of inflammatory oils. And they're so easy to sub out. So just stop using those oils. The only trick ends up being restaurants, because restaurants use a lot of canola oil because it's vegetarian and it's inexpensive and people don't tend to have like highly allergic reactions to it. But heating canola oil, like eating French fries fried in canola oil, which is every restaurant everywhere pretty much, is something that you just don't want to be doing a lot of. And I am saying that as a very sad person because I love French fries. And so I really do endeavor to not eat them in restaurants very often, just for that reason. I can even tell I feel really crappy after I eat it. So still delicious, but limit the amount of it. And then when you're at home, just eliminate it completely and be cooking with at lower temperatures and using cold extra virgin olive oil. For higher heat cooking, you can use filtered avocado oil or ghee if you can eat a little bit of dairy. Those are both great at high heat. Coconut oil, I personally don't eat because I'm very sensitive to it. That's an example of a healthy food for some people that is incredibly inflammatory for me. So it's very individual. But heating coconut oil no higher than kind of medium is a good way to use it. And I don't encourage people to cook with a ton of it just because it is a very highly saturated fat. You're actually better off cooking with a little bit of animal fat, which has a little bit more, surprisingly, like even pork lard, monounsaturated fat in it than coconut products do. So I like to save a little bit of bacon fat or a little bit of beef fat if I'm going to be using higher heat and roasting in the oven. Duck fat is great. You can buy the Epic brand in jars now. It's expensive, but you don't have to use a lot of it at any one time. And potatoes roasted in duck fat are pretty incredible. So anyway, very easy to sub out industrial oils and certainly lower the inflammatory effect of those oils. Number 3 is an example of a food that can be very healthy for you, or it can just absolutely tank you, and that is nightshade vegetables. Those include tomatoes, eggplants, chilies, goji berries. It's a little bit not intuitive, but and white potatoes. Those are sort of the main usual suspects. And I can eat white potatoes just fine, but if I start eating tomatoes too often, which I have been doing lately because it is summer and they're amazing, and I was in Europe and we had lots of lovely chilies and tomatoes while we were there, it really just starts to show up as joint pain for me. It's very pronounced and it takes probably 2 or 3 days of eating it solidly, so I have to really work at it. But I love tomatoes and I love chilies, and so once I start, they almost have an addictive quality to them. And I know I've talked with other people who have this sensation too, that eating chilies starts to be kind of addictive. And I usually pay attention to that symptom. If something starts to make me crave it, I tend to back away from it because I believe that it's causing some inflammation for me. So how's that for a thought? I'd love to know if you have kind of noticed some of the same things. And what I use as a substitution when I'm looking for heat in a dish is I will turn to ginger instead, or even horseradish, fresh horseradish root, or raw radishes. If I'm making a salad that I want to have some heat in it, or to have tacos, for instance. So it's really fun to play with those 3 flavors. We tend to not use them as often because we're so used to counting on chilies, and then when you don't have that option, it's really fun to explore with those other 3 flavors and what they can contribute to a dish. And they're all very nutritious. Ginger, radishes, and horseradish are all very nutritious in their own right. Tomatoes are really hard to sub for. They just have their own qualities, as you know. They're sweet, they're savory, they're kind of earthy, they have a saltiness, and it's hard to make a substitution for tomato products. There are actually some relatively decent Casey Naturals sauces that you can buy off of Amazon. Some grocery stores carry them, and they're completely autoimmune protocol compliant, which means that they don't have nightshades in them. And there's some fun flavors. I have an AIP barbecue sauce on my website, Fresh Tart. It's in the ribs post, the recent one that I did, probably 3 or 4 posts past. And that is a delicious sub. It's easier if you kind of go down the route of Asian seasonings. But some of the flavors that you can play with and that some of the AIP barbecue sauces play with include beets for that kind of earthiness, carrots to add sweetness, definitely acid. Tomatoes are very acidic, and so finding acid in vinegar or citrus, in combination with these other flavors kind of starts to, you start to build that profile. Using onions, of course, for that savory earthiness, and then using dark, less sweet fruits like cherries, for instance, can make a really terrific barbecue sauce. So it's fun to play around with some of those. There's some very interesting recipes online, and definitely check out the barbecue sauce recipe that I have on my blog, Fresh Tart. And then for eggplant, I love to use zucchini. Really, the only eggplant that I'm missing are sort of 2 dishes. One, kind of the classic eggplant caviar eggplant spread, where you char eggplants over a burner or on a grill. Always put a little slice in them, by the way. I have exploded eggplants on my grill before, which is a giant mess. Or you could also make that mistake in the oven, I'm sure. So, but you just treat zucchinis the same way. You char the zucchinis, blacken their skin, and let them cool in a paper bag so that they impart that smoky flavor throughout the flesh of the zucchini, and then you mash it with garlic and lemon and all of the things that make a great eggplant caviar. Or if you love eggplant parmesan, then substituting zucchini in for the eggplant works kind of like a dream. I've put zucchini in lasagna too. That would have maybe been kind of an eggplant preparation. So it's really a good substitution, and you don't really even miss eggplant at all. That's probably the easiest one of all the nightshades to substitute for. Number 4 is alcohol, which we've talked about several times before. If you're trying to cut back on alcohol, you will certainly notice a major anti-inflammatory effect. You can see it in your face right away. You can feel it in your sleep right away. Alcohol has a lot of empty calories. It's really hard on your liver. Those things all contribute to gaining weight and having weight gain around your middle. And it really messes with women's hormones. So if you're experiencing a lot of hot flashes and kind of perimenopause symptoms, cutting back on alcohol can be a very, very quick way to really bring some of those symptoms down and to, bring the inflammation down. So how do you substitute out for alcohol? For me, I always like to have a glass of wine if I was cooking dinner. That kind of was an association that was kind of set in my brain. And so it's very easy to change a habit if you sub out a new, better trigger, basically, or a new, better reward for the same trigger. So the trigger is cooking dinner or whatever your trigger is, and then sub in something else that you really enjoy drinking, whether it's kombucha, whether it's sparkling water, which I would suggest adding some sort of acid like apple cider vinegar or lemon to, and then something a little bit of sweet like maybe a little bit of maple syrup, because alcohol does deliver some sugar into your system, and so having a little bit of sweetness in what you're drinking can sort of trigger the same dopamine response, and that's kind of what you're looking for. You're looking for a new reward to an old trigger. So kombucha or sparkling water that has some sort of acid and sweetness to it. I've had a lot of people who have used healing green broth because at the end of the day, part of the reason alcohol tastes good is your blood sugar's low, you're hungry, you don't want to be snacking while you're eating dinner. And making a batch of healing green broth to sip while you're cooking has been a really cool way that people have used healing green broth. You can go to healinggreenbroth.com and sign up for the free challenge, which is 4 weeks of healing green broth recipes, totally free, lots of fun ideas, and something you could definitely play with if you're trying to cut back on alcohol. And then number 5, of course, is sugar. Everybody's trying to cut back on sugar, and my tricks are kind of the same. I think we tend to crave sugar at certain times of day, perhaps as an afternoon snack. That used to be true for me when I worked in an office. We always had cookies in our office. We always had a coffee break. We would go downstairs to the coffee bar and we would pick up something. And so I started to plug in a different reward to that same response. Whether it was at this time of year, it would be very easy to sub in an amazing peach, some incredible locally grown strawberries, some really good blueberries, kind of picking fresh fruit, and particularly fruit that's a little bit lower sugar, like berries. But still, at this time of year, I would go for peaches, I'd go for melon, anything that's absolutely incredible. It's pretty easy to do this time of year, and I would plug that in instead. Another thing that I like to do if I feel like I've gotten into the groove of eating dessert, like when I'm on vacation, is I'll come home and roast a bunch of sweet potatoes, and then I just do a really slow roast so they're quite sweet. And then I take that sweet potato, flesh out, and mash it with salt and with cinnamon. And then I just bank it in my fridge. And when I'm really, really hungry for something sweet, I'll just eat a few spoonfuls of that. And I love pumpkin pie. It absolutely exists, in the realm of pumpkin pie in my brain. And it really takes care of sweet cravings. Sometimes it hits me in the afternoon, sometimes it hits me after dinner, and then I usually kind of taper it away. I don't eat dessert on a regular basis, but I do when I'm on vacation, and it is amazing. It takes like 2 days, and I am ready to have dessert every day. So once you know that it's a dopamine trigger in your brain, and as easy as it is to establish it, you can also unestablish it by substituting in a whole food that is much lower in sugar and has nutrients in it as well. Dark chocolate, of course, is a classic. If you're following AIP, that doesn't work so well. But in that case, I would use perhaps dates, although not a lot of them because they are very high in sugar. But dates and coconut, and using some coconut products can really help you past sweet cravings in the afternoon or after dinner. But if you can eat chocolate, the darker the better, and it really has quite a sweet, satisfying effect without really raising your blood sugar and creating wild cravings. It's kind of hard to binge on super dark chocolate. And then I often will sub in herbal tea, which sounds kind of boring, but there's something really nice about making myself a cup of tea. I think it's the routine of it. It feels relaxing. It feels a little indulgent. And many herbal teas have a natural sweetness to them without adding a sweetener to them. And that tends to sort of fit into, again, sort of this category in my brain of dessert or a treat. And then I kind of forget about it for a while, and then I get back in the groove of it, and I think, why do I ever let this go? Because this is so pleasant, and it really does stand in for having dessert. I also use decaf coffee that way in restaurants. Instead of ordering dessert in restaurants, I'll often have a decaf coffee or some decaf tea, and it really just feels like flavor after the meal, and it's just a different reward for the same trigger. So if you can kind of think of sugar that way, and alcohol, both of those sort of fit into that trigger reward really nicely, and just plugging in a new reward for an old trigger can be a pretty quick way to develop a new habit. So I'll stop there. Didn't want to talk too long today. Anyway, if you have questions about other substitutions, leave them below, or if you have your own tips that have worked well, everybody would love to hear them. And I'll be back next week, but make sure to leave questions below, and hope you have a good afternoon, you guys. Thanks for tuning in. See you later. Bye.